I never imagined that one day I would feel like a stranger in my own family. That a belief system meant to bring people together could be used to tear them apart. I was raised to respect faith, not to fear it. To me, religion was always a place of comfort, a quiet strength during difficult times. But now, sitting alone in a borrowed room, far from the laughter of my granddaughter and the warmth of my daughter's home, I wonder, how did faith become the wall between us? It didn't happen all at once. At first, I was proud that my daughter had found someone who seemed grounded and devoted. A man of God, a pastor, what more could a father ask for his little girl? I thought she'd found stability, purpose, maybe even peace. But somewhere along the way, that same devotion became a weapon. A way to divide. To label. To judge. I didn't see it coming, not until it was too late. Not until I heard the words that would change everything. And what hurt the most wasn't being called a burden. It was who said it. And who was there to hear it. The first time I visited their new home after they got married, I noticed the change right away. There was a calmness in the air, almost rehearsed. Soft gospel music played in the background. Bible verses framed on the walls. Everyone greeted me kindly, politely, but there was a certain distance. Like I had walked into a space where I didn't quite belong. My daughter looked happy, or at least, she looked like she was trying very hard to be. She had always been strong-willed, full of opinions, never afraid to push back. But now she seemed more careful with her words, like each sentence needed permission before being spoken. I didn't think much of it then. I told myself she was just adapting to married life. Her husband, the pastor, welcomed me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He spoke slowly, choosing his words the way a politician might. Measured. Calculated. He asked if I believed in Jesus Christ, not as a conversation, but as a test. I told him I believed in kindness, in compassion, in doing right by others. He nodded, but I could feel the chill behind that smile. From that day on, I stopped being dad and started being the man who hasn't accepted the Lord. When my daughter told me she was marrying a pastor, I smiled and said I was happy for her. Deep down, I hoped this man would treat her with the respect and freedom she deserved. She had been through enough disappointment in life. I wanted to believe this was finally her turn for joy. The wedding was simple, filled with prayers and blessings. Everyone from his church was there, dressed modestly, speaking softly. I sat in the second row, trying to ignore the looks I got when I didn't bow my head during the third prayer. It wasn't disrespect, I was just lost in thought. I remember watching my daughter say her vows, her voice calm, her eyes focused on him like he was the center of her universe. And maybe, from that moment on, he was. At first, everything seemed fine. She would call me once a week, tell me about her new responsibilities at church, how proud she was to support her husband's mission. But slowly, her world began to shrink. Friends disappeared. Her career faded into the background. Every decision seemed to pass through him first. When I asked her about it, she said, "This is what marriage is, Dad. We are one in spirit now." I wanted to believe her. But I could feel it, this wasn't unity. It was control dressed up as faith. If there was one light that kept my heart alive during all those early days of tension, it was my granddaughter. From the moment she could walk, she would run into my arms like nothing else in the world mattered. Her laughter was my favorite song. Her little drawings, always with Grandpa scrawled in the corner, were my most cherished gifts. She didn't care about sermons or scripture. To her, I wasn't spiritually misaligned or in need of correction. I was simply Grandpa, the man who made silly faces, who brought her ice cream, who clapped the loudest at her school recitals. We had our own little world, untouched by the judgments of the adults around us. I used to sit with her in the backyard and tell her stories about her mother when she was a little girl. How she once tried to paint our dog blue. How she used to fall asleep on my chest during thunderstorms. My granddaughter would giggle, wide-eyed, soaking in every word. "Tell me another one, Grandpa." She'd beg. And I always did. In those moments, I felt like I still had a place in their lives. Like maybe, no matter what her parents thought of me, this little girl saw me, really saw me, for who I was. But even that light would begin to dim. It started with the little things. A change in tone when my daughter answered my calls. A hesitation before inviting me over. Once, I showed up with a toy for my granddaughter, just a simple doll dressed like a firefighter. She loved it, but my son-in-law took one look and said, "We prefer to encourage more biblical play in this house." At first, I brushed it off. Every family has its quirks, right? But over time, those quirks became patterns. I noticed how my granddaughter stopped sharing certain things with me. How she'd look to her father for approval before hugging me. How my daughter, once so open, began to speak to me like I was a guest, someone who needed to be managed. One Sunday, I came to their church to surprise them. After the service, I waved to my granddaughter from across the room. She saw me and smiled, about to run toward me, but her father gently held her back. Just a hand on her shoulder. No words. But enough to stop her. That was the day I realized I was no longer seen as safe. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because I wasn't one of them. I wasn't part of the spiritual structure they were building. I was just the man standing outside the gate, watching his family slowly close it. They began inviting me to prayer meetings, not as family gatherings, but as something closer to intervention. At first, I accepted. I wanted to be included. I thought maybe if I just showed up, listened respectfully, they'd see that I was trying to understand their world. But it wasn't long before I realized I wasn't really there to participate. I was there to be transformed. They would circle around me, hands gently reaching out, their voices rising in prayer. At first, I bowed my head politely. But soon, I felt the weight of their words, remove the spirit of resistance. Break the chains of pride. Lead into full submission. I wasn't being welcomed. I was being corrected. After one particular session, my daughter pulled me aside and said, "Dad, I know you mean well, but you're blocking the flow of the Spirit when you sit there silently. You need to open your heart." I wanted to tell her that my heart had always been open, to her, to my granddaughter, to peace. But I could see in her eyes that she meant something different. To them, open-hearted meant obedient. And obedient meant agreeing with everything they said, believed, and demanded. I stopped attending after that. I told them it wasn't for me. But deep inside, I knew the damage had already begun. In their eyes, I had confirmed what they feared. I was spiritually unaligned. And worse, I was now seen as a threat. From then on, my relationship with my son-in-law changed. He no longer tried to hide his discomfort around me. The polite smiles turned into tight-lipped nods. His eyes followed me more closely, as if waiting for me to say something out of line. I could feel it in the room whenever I visited, the tension, the silent calculations behind every word I spoke. Conversations became battles in disguise. If I mentioned a book I was reading, he'd quote scripture to contradict it. If I praised my granddaughter's curiosity, he'd remind her to focus on godly knowledge. Once, I jokingly told her that dinosaurs were the coolest animals to ever walk the earth, and he gently corrected me in front of her. "Grandpa doesn't know the full truth, sweetie. We trust God's timeline, not the world's." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every correction chipped away at my presence in her world. At dinner one night, I offered to say grace. It was something I had done with my daughter when she was a little girl, our own simple way of giving thanks. But this time, he interrupted before I could finish. "Let me lead us in proper prayer," he said, his voice calm but firm. I stepped back, embarrassed, silenced in front of my own family. It became clear, I wasn't just a visitor in his home, I was an influence he needed to manage. An opposing current that threatened the flow of his authority. And though no one said it out loud, I began to understand my role. I was no longer the grandfather. I was the obstacle. It was a Saturday evening, quiet, calm, the kind of night where families sit together and talk about their week. I had been invited for dinner, though I suspected it was more out of obligation than warmth. Still, I went. For my granddaughter. She was the first to greet me at the door, hugging me tight like she always did. Her innocence was a balm I didn't know I needed. We played a little while dinner was being prepared. She laughed. I laughed. It felt normal. It felt good. Until it didn't. At the table, the pastor asked my granddaughter to share what she had learned in Sunday school. She spoke about obedience, about listening to authority, and how bad influences can lead people away from God. Her words were rehearsed, almost too perfect for a child her age. I nodded and said, "That's very thoughtful, sweetheart. But always remember, it's okay to ask questions too." That's when everything shifted. He put his fork down, looked directly at me, and said, "This is exactly what I've been warning her about." I froze. My daughter looked away. "You're a spiritual obstacle in this house," he continued. "You resist God's truth, and now you're trying to pass that down to my daughter. That's not just harmful, it's dangerous." I sat in stunned silence. The room felt smaller. My granddaughter looked confused, eyes darting between us. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, but the words wouldn't come. I wasn't just being criticized, I was being condemned, right there at the dinner table, in front of the child who loved me. And in that moment, I realized something deeper than pain. I wasn't welcome anymore. Not just in that house, but in the lives they were building without me. After he said it, "You're a spiritual obstacle," the room went quiet. But it wasn't an ordinary silence. It was the kind that seems to echo. A silence that presses against your chest and makes it hard to breathe. I didn't look at him. I didn't look at my daughter. My eyes went straight to hers, my granddaughter. She wasn't crying. She didn't speak. But the way she looked at me, wide-eyed, confused, almost afraid, cut through me deeper than any words could. That little spark of joy she always had when I walked into the room. It was gone. Replaced with something heavy. Something I didn't recognize in her face before, uncertainty. It wasn't just what he had said, it was how it made her feel about me. She sat still, holding her napkin in both hands like she didn't know where else to look. And then she asked quietly, "Is Grandpa not good with God?" I couldn't answer. My throat locked up. My daughter whispered something under her breath and tried to redirect the conversation, but the damage was done. A line had been drawn, and my granddaughter had been made to stand on one side of it. I had always believed that love, real love, could protect a child from judgment. That the bond between a grandfather and his granddaughter was immune to things like doctrine and dogma. But in that moment, I saw something I never wanted to see, the beginning of a wedge. Not just between me and her father, but between me and her. The next morning, I woke up early and stood outside their house for a few minutes before knocking. I had slept poorly, replaying the night over and over again in my mind. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe things weren't as final as they felt. I still had hope, fragile, but alive, that we could smooth things over. That I could see my granddaughter again, maybe take her to the park like we used to. But when the door opened, it wasn't her who greeted me. It was my daughter. She stepped outside and closed the door behind her. Her eyes were tired. Her voice low. "Dad, I think we need a little space. Just for a while. Things got heavy last night." I asked if I could say goodbye to my granddaughter. She paused, then said, "I think it's best if we let her process. She's asking a lot of questions." Process. That word stayed with me. I stood there on the porch, holding a small gift I had brought, a book I knew she'd love. But I couldn't hand it to her. I wasn't even allowed to see her. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a pause. This was a pivot. From that day on, the visits stopped. The calls became fewer. Messages went unanswered. And a new kind of silence settled in, not one that screamed like before, but one that lingered. A cold, still silence that made everything that came before feel like it belonged to someone else's life. My place in their world had changed. And there was no going back. It took me a week to gather the courage to call her again. When she finally picked up, her voice was kind, but distant. Like she had already made peace with a decision I hadn't even been allowed to be part of. I asked her if we could talk. Just the two of us. No pastor. No prayer circle. Just father and daughter. She agreed, and we met at a quiet coffee shop we used to go to when she was younger. I brought a photo with me, one of her as a child, sitting on my shoulders at the beach. I thought it might help her remember who we were before all of this. We sat down. I looked her in the eye and asked, "Do you really believe I'm a danger to my own granddaughter?" She didn't answer right away. She looked down at her cup. Then she said something I'll never forget. "Dad, you don't believe the same things we believe. And that means your influence is different. Not evil, just not aligned." I asked her if she remembered all the nights I stayed up with her when she was sick. All the school plays I cheered at. The scraped knees I cleaned. The heartbreaks I helped her through. I asked her if that kind of love could really be seen as a threat. She wiped a tear from her eye and whispered, "It's not about love, Dad. It's about obedience. About order." That's when I knew. She had already chosen. Not just between me and her husband, but between the father who raised her and the doctrine that now defined her world. And no matter how gently she said it, the message was clear. I wasn't part of that world anymore. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my small apartment, staring at the old photo albums, the drawings my granddaughter had made for me, the quiet reminders of a life that felt like it had ended without a sound. I kept asking myself, should I fight harder? Should I demand my place as a father, as a grandfather? Should I shout, argue, plead? But what would that do? I had seen what pushing too hard could cost. The tighter I held on, the further they would drift. And I didn't want my granddaughter to grow up hearing my name only in the context of conflict. So I made the hardest decision of my life. I stepped back. Not out of shame. Not out of surrender. But out of love. I sent my daughter one final message. I told her I would always be here. That the door to my life would never be locked. That I would never stop loving her or her daughter. And that if they ever needed me, truly needed me, I would come without hesitation or condition. Then I turned off my phone and sat quietly for a long time. It's a strange thing, to choose dignity over desperation. To walk away, not because you want to, but because clinging too tightly might destroy the very bond you're trying to protect. But I did it. Because sometimes the most powerful act of love is the one that asks nothing in return. In the weeks that followed, I found myself walking more. Long walks, quiet streets, sometimes no destination at all, just movement, just air. I thought about faith. About forgiveness. About how often they're preached and how rarely they're practiced. I wasn't angry at God. I never had been. My quarrel wasn't with heaven, it was with the way some people use heaven as a weapon. How could a faith that claims to be built on love turn a father into a stranger? How could people who speak of grace look at someone like me, who raised a child alone, who sacrificed everything, who showed up again and again, and label me a danger? I started reading scripture on my own. Quietly. Not to convert. Not to debate. Just to understand. And I kept coming back to the stories of the prodigal son, the lost sheep, the leper who was touched when no one else would come near. Those stories didn't speak of rules. They spoke of love. Of reaching out. Of welcoming home. And yet, here I was, cast out not for sin, but for questioning. For refusing to pretend. For being myself. I wasn't asking for approval. I was asking for a seat at the table. For my granddaughter to know that love doesn't always look like a sermon. But in their version of faith, there was no space for my kind of love. And I can't help but wonder. If forgiveness doesn't live there. What kind of faith is it, really? I wrote it on a rainy afternoon. Just a single page, folded carefully, tucked into an envelope that still sits in the top drawer of my nightstand. I never mailed it. Never gave it to anyone. But I wrote it for her. For someday. It begins simply. My sweet girl. If you're reading this, it means you've grown. Maybe you're old enough now to ask your own questions, to hear your own heart without someone else translating it for you. I told her about the day she was born. How I waited in the hospital hallway pacing like a nervous teenager, how I cried the first time I held her tiny fingers. I wrote about the picnics, the backyard fairy hunts, the made-up songs we sang in the car. I told her that none of those memories were ever tainted by theology. They were built on laughter, imagination, and the kind of love that doesn't come with a label. I didn't speak badly about her parents. I didn't try to defend myself. I just wanted her to know that love had lived here, always. Even in the silence. Even in the distance. Even now. If someday you feel like something's missing, I wrote, if there's a question in your heart about the man they said I was, I hope you'll read this and know, you were never a reason for pain. You were my greatest joy. And at the bottom, I signed it. Forever your grandpa, no matter what they told you. Life doesn't always give us the ending we hoped for. Sometimes, the people we love most drift away, not because we hurt them, but because we didn't fit into the mold they were handed. Sometimes, faith becomes less about compassion and more about control. And sometimes, you're forced to let go, just to protect what little piece you have left. But even in that letting go, I've discovered something. Love doesn't vanish just because it's pushed away. It sits quietly, patiently, like an old letter in a drawer, waiting for the day it might be needed. I still think about my granddaughter. I still talk to her in my thoughts. I wonder if she remembers the silly songs, the warm hugs, the way I used to spin her in circles until we both got dizzy. I hope those memories are still somewhere inside her. And if someday she knocks on my door, even if it's years from now, I'll open it with the same arms that once carried her, no questions asked. Because love, real love, doesn't keep score. It just waits. If this story touched your heart, I'd love for you to leave a comment below. Tell me if you've ever felt something similar, or if you know someone who has. Your voice matters more than you know. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need it. Thank you for being here. Truly.